Section 1 of the Making of the British Empire, A.D. 1714 to 1832. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Pamela Nagami, M.D. The Making of the British Empire, A.D. 1714 to 1832, by Arthur Hassel. Chapter 1. The First Years of the House of Hanover, 1714 to 1721. The accession of George, Elector of Hanover and great-grandson of James I, to the throne of England, in virtue of the Act of Settlement, took place without any disturbance. The new king, who arrived in England on September 18th, 1714, was a German, equally ignorant of the English tongue and of the character of the constitution over which he had to preside. A quiet, cautious, unostentatious man, George had none of those qualities which are likely to rouse enthusiasm among his subjects. But he was hard-working and businesslike. He made no attempt to tamper with the constitution, and he trusted his ministers implicitly. His accession marks not only the establishment of the political ascendancy of the Whigs and the development of party government, but also the commencement of that close connection between England and Hanover which so often affected our domestic and foreign politics down to the accession of George III. There is little doubt that George I was admirably suited for the position of King of England. At the moment of his accession, the political and religious enthusiasms of the 17th century were yielding to commercial and materialistic tendencies. The English were rapidly becoming the chief trading nation of Europe. They were planting colonies in the New World and definitely aiming at securing the maritime supremacy which they still enjoy. Before this expansion of commerce, with its attendant growth of wealth and prosperity, that interest in things religious which had characterized the 17th century was dying, and giving space to a more philosophic, if not a sceptical spirit. The 18th century has been aptly called the Age of Reason, and this saying admirably expresses the state of feeling in England under the early Georges. Even before the advent of the great industrial period, commerce and manufactures had made considerable strides. In 1715, silk spinning with improved machinery was introduced at Derby. About 1740, a system for working iron with pit coal was for the first time regularly employed, while many and various improvements were being made with regard to agriculture. Between the death of Anne and the arrival of George I, the country was governed by a council of regency composed of Whigs, which gave way to an exclusively Whig ministry under Lord Townshend, who, as principal Secretary of State, was practically chief minister. With him were associated Robert Walpole, who, at first paymaster of the forces, became in October 1715 Chancellor of the Exchequer, Pulteney, Shrewsbury, Sunderland, and all the other recognised chiefs of the party, including Marlborough. With the appointment of the new government began a period of Whig ascendancy which continued unbroken till the accession of George III. The Whig party, which, after a sharp struggle with the Tories, now entered upon a long tenure of power, found its chief support among the mercantile classes and the Nonconformists, and in the parliamentary influence of the House of Lords. Care for trade, commerce, and colonial expansion naturally led the moneyed classes to support the Hanoverian settlement, while the Nonconformists, who had suffered under the late Tory ministry, welcomed the accession of George I with enthusiasm. Since the Revolution, too, the majority of the peers had sided with the Whigs. After the death of Anne, they acted with the Crown, and by their local influence obtained a complete control over the lower house. Under the first two Georges, the government of the Whigs has been compared to the rule of the Venetian oligarchy, so completely had the House of Commons ceased to represent the nation. Considering the state of foreign affairs and the fact that he was a foreigner and unable to take much share in the government, George was wise in deciding to throw himself unreservedly into the hands of the Whigs. Mixed governments had been tried in the reigns of William III and Anne, but had not been successful. The Whigs rather than the Tories were interested in the maintenance of the ideas of the Revolution of 1688. They were, moreover, regarded in an especial sense not only as trustees of the Revolution settlement, but also as the defenders of the Protestant succession. The new Parliament, which met in March 1715, was strongly Whig, and at once took energetic and vindictive measures against the Tories. The negotiations which had led to the Peace of Utrecht were condemned, and of the late ministers, Bolingbroke and Ormond, who had fled to France, were attainted, while Oxford, Robert Harley, was impeached and committed to the Tower. In 1717 the proceedings against him were allowed to drop, and he was released. But the policy adopted by the government towards the Tories was continued, though in a less violent manner, all through the reigns of George I and that of his successor. The Tories were carefully excluded from office for many years. They were inaccurately identified with the Jacobites, and not infrequently they numbered but 60 to 80 in the House of Commons. Before the year was over, however, the government was called upon to deal with a much more serious affair than the dubious treason of the late Tory ministry of 1712-14. In September, a vigorous Jacobite rebellion, headed by the Earl of Mar, broke out in Scotland, due to some extent to the uncalled-for measures of the triumphant Whigs. On the English side of the border, Lord Derwentwater, Mr. Forster, and a few country gentlemen of Northumberland and Lancashire took up arms. The rising, which was in full harmony with public opinion in the Lowlands as well as in the Highlands, might have had some chance of success had it been managed by an able leader, had France given it loyal support, had the Pretender been in Scotland when his flag was unfurled, and had the movements in England and Scotland taken place simultaneously. But not one of these requisite conditions of success was present. On November 13th the English Jacobites were defeated at Preston, and the Scottish insurgents were checked at the indecisive battle of Sheriff Muir. The Pretender, who only landed in Scotland on December 22nd, sailed back to France on February 4th, 1716, and the rebellion ended in disastrous failure. The reasons for this failure are not hard to seek. The conflict of the principle of loyalty to the Church and loyalty to the Crown rendered the large majority of Englishmen undecided and unwilling to rise. They dared not risk the results that might follow if they placed a bigoted Papist on the throne. The rising, moreover, was badly organized. No secrecy was kept. Bolingbroke and the Duke of Berwick, the most able of the Pretender's supporters, were hardly consulted, and John, Earl of Mar, an incapable leader, was ordered to raise the standard before any promises of French help had been secured, and before any rising was prepared in England. The rebellion has with justice been described as a ludicrous exhibition of recklessness and mismanagement almost without parallel in history. During the rebellion the Whigs had, as in 1714, acted with vigour. Sir William Wyndham, Lord Jersey, and other influential Tories were arrested, and secure of the neutrality of the Regent Philip of Orleans, who, since the death of Louis XIV, September 1st, 1715, had governed France, the ministers were enabled to use all available forces against the Jacobites. The success of the government strengthened the position of the new dynasty in England, and enabled the Whigs to take measures for establishing their power on a stable basis. Severities such as the execution of many Jacobites, including Lords Derwentwater and Kenmure, struck terror into the discontented. But the victory of the Whigs did not raise any feelings of enthusiasm for the House of Hanover. the sentiment of loyalty disappeared. It was impossible to wax emotional over the phlegmatic George. High aims and ideals, indeed, were fast vanishing at the time. Christian zeal began to slumber, and the Church entered into a period of sluggish calm, intensified by the systematic promotion of latitudinarian Whigs to high ecclesiastical posts. English parliaments had since 1689 been dissolved every 3 years. To avert the outbreak of any fresh disorder, and to avoid the risk of the return of a Tory majority, the government decided to postpone the elections due in 1717 till 1721. With that object the Septennial Act was passed on May 7th, 1716. It has remained in force ever since. Against this measure violent criticism was aroused. It was asserted, with truth, that it increased corruption in elections and in the House of Commons. Its social influence was bad for the country gentlemen, who had to spend a considerable portion of the year in London, because they were no longer compelled to devote as much time to cultivating good relations with their constituents as when elections were more frequent. Nor could it be denied that Parliament, in extending its own tenure, was acting in a very high-handed and illegal manner. In favour of the measure it has been urged that in lessening the number of elections it has relieved the country from much expense, turmoil, and agitation, that it helped to secure the establishment of the House of Hanover, that it increased the power of the House of Commons, that it gives greater independence to members and a fair trial to the policy of ministers, that it has rendered English foreign policy more stable. In short, the circumstances of the time fully justified the passing of the bill. The rebellion had thus given the Whigs an opportunity of consolidating their power. Parliament ceased to represent the nation. Parliamentary contests degenerated into greedy struggles for place and power, and the dominant majority, those supplying admirable administrators, rested on an oligarchy of great Whig nobles. Secure of their position, the Whigs at once fell to quarrelling among themselves in 1717. They soon broke up into 2 parties, the one headed by Stanhope and Sunderland, and the other by Townshend and Walpole. Various circumstances had concurred to bring about misunderstandings between the 2 sections of Whig leaders, and to alienate the king from Walpole and Townshend. In 1716 George had crossed the seas, taking Stanhope with him to look after his electorate of Hanover, which had become involved in a war with Sweden. During his absence, Lord Townshend had sought the favour of the Prince of Wales, who was on very bad terms with his father, and had thus made himself odious to the Hanoverian courtiers in England. Moreover, he had opposed his master's policy with regard to the Czar, Peter the Great, who, though nominally our ally, was regarded by the king with grave distrust. In addition, George personally disliked Townshend, and had quarrelled with Walpole over a Hanoverian money matter, the payment of some electoral troops brought over to aid in suppressing the Jacobite rising of 1715. The Earl of Sunderland, who was discontented at having been made Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, joined the king and Stanhope at Hanover, and by his intrigues largely contributed to the overthrow of existing political arrangements. In December 1716 Townshend was dismissed from his Secretaryship of State and sent into honourable banishment as Lord Lieutenant of Ireland. Early in April 1717, in consequence of a strong opposition being made in Parliament by Townshend's party to a money grant for an attack on Sweden, George dismissed Townshend even from that office, and the next day Walpole and Pulteney resigned. Both Stanhope and Sunderland, who were the leading spirits in the new administration, were able and industrious ministers, though the latter represented the oligarchical views held by a large portion of the dominant Whigs. Under the influence of the former minister, the Schism and Occasional Conformity Acts were repealed, to the great joy of the whole body of Protestant dissenters, while Sunderland was responsible for the attempt to pass the Peerage Bill in 1719. The Whig aristocracy, as a body, feared the power of the crown as much as that of the people. They wished to perpetuate their predominance, and to become permanently independent of royal influence. It was feared that the Prince of Wales, who was still on bad terms with his father, would, on his accession, overthrow the existing ministry by means of a creation of peers. The government therefore brought in a bill which provided that the crown should not have the power of adding more than 6 new peerages to the existing 178, so that there should never be more than 184 in all. Had this bill been carried, an exclusive hereditary nobility would have been created, and no means would have existed for bringing pressure to bear on the House of Lords when serious differences arose between it and the Commons. Fortunately, the opposition of Walpole to the measure proved successful, and the bill was rejected by 209 to 177. The skill, judgment, and firmness of Walpole had saved our system of government from a great disaster. Shortly afterwards a sort of reconciliation was patched up between the two Whig factions, and Townshend became Lord President, while Walpole was made paymaster of the forces. All opposition to the government ceased, but in 1721 the ministry was ruined owing to the South Sea bubble. The South Sea Company, a trading venture started in 1711, had been greatly benefited by the grant of the asiento, or right to supply Spanish America with negro slaves, and to send 1 ship annually to the Spanish colonies in South America. Though ostensibly a trading body, the company was mainly interested in financial operations. In 1719 the chairman of the company, supported by Sunderland and by Aislabie, the first Lord of the Treasury and the Chancellor of the Exchequer, started a proposal to take over the responsibility for the whole of the national debt, a certain rate of interest being paid to the company for a stated period. A counter-proposal made by the Bank of England was rejected by Parliament, and the South Sea Company, which already enjoyed the monopoly of British trade with Mexico and Peru, took advantage of its victory and of the anxiety of the public to share in its profits, and issued £1,000,000 new stock at a high premium. A further issue at a still higher premium was equally successful, and in August 1720 South Sea stock stood at 1,000%. During the mania many bogus companies were formed, often under distinguished patronage. People were found foolish enough to invest in schemes for discovering perpetual motion and utilizing it for machinery, for discovering buried treasure, even for engaging in a secret undertaking of profit which shall presently be made public. When those bubble companies began to fail, the South Sea shares also sank in value, for all holders of shares grew despondent and wished to realize their money at once. Its bonds gradually fell from 1,000 down to 135. When the inevitable crash came, the nation turned to Walpole, who had from the first opposed the South Sea scheme, and had resisted the passage of the bill in the House of Commons. The ministry, several members of which had been closely connected with the company, was discredited. Sunderland resigned, Craggs committed suicide, Aislabie was expelled from the House of Commons as having been guilty of notorious corruption, while Stanhope, who was not seriously implicated, died in February 1722. Before he fell, Stanhope had brought to a successful conclusion his schemes of foreign policy, which had for their object the preservation of peace. After the failure of the Jacobite rebellion, the ministers found that the principal source of danger to the tranquillity of Europe lay in the ambitious designs of the Spanish court and in the opposition of Russia and Prussia to Charles XII. of Sweden. In France, the Regent Orleans, threatened by Philip V. of Spain, was impelled to look to England for assistance. In Dubois he found a minister ready to thwart the schemes of the court of Madrid by means of an alliance with the Whigs. Many difficulties had to be overcome before a durable alliance between England and France could be made. The interests of George I. were Hanoverian. The essence of his foreign policy was friendship with Holland and Austria had been for 50 years the deadly foe of France. In July, however, Dubois met Stanhope at the Hague, and in August he proceeded to Hanover, where he found George in great anxiety about a purely electoral matter, the suspicious conduct of Peter the Great towards Mecklenburg, and wholly concerned about the safety of his German possessions. The possibility of a recrudescence of Jacobite activity aided Dubois' policy, and a defensive alliance was signed between England and France on November 28th, and on January 4th, 1717, the adhesion of Holland completed the arrangement known as the Triple Alliance. It is impossible to overrate the importance of this union of France and England, which implied a reversal of the policy of Louis XIV. The Regent Orleans undertook to expel the Pretender from French territory, to dismantle Dunkirk, and to destroy the works of Mardyk, two ports which England regarded with suspicion. The Protestant succession in England and the separation of the crowns of France and Spain were assured. The Whig government had thus successfully carried out an arrangement which, in largely contributing to strengthen the Hanoverian dynasty, proved of vast importance to England. Later in the year hostilities broke out between Spain and Austria, and in November a Spanish fleet conquered Sardinia. Alarmed at the prospect of the renewal of a general European war, the Whig government called upon France and Holland to unite in resisting Spanish aggressions. In taking this step, Stanhope ignored the fact that as Charles VI. Was aiming at the occupation of Sicily, which since the Peace of Utrecht had been in the hands of the House of Savoy, Spain was perfectly justified in taking measures to checkmate the Emperor. In July 1718, Alberoni, the Spanish minister, projected and carried out the conquest of Sicily, a rash act, seeing that Spain was practically isolated in Europe. But Alberoni refused to believe that French arms would be employed against the Spanish Bourbons, and he was convinced that England, anxious for the extension of commercial privileges, would be opposed to a permanent Austrian occupation of Sicily. His hopes proved groundless. The Spanish fleet was destroyed by Admiral Byng at the Battle of Cape Passaro on August 11th, 1718. The Emperor joined the Triple Alliance, which thus became the Quadruple Alliance, and France and England attacked Spain. In December 1719, Alberoni, treated as a scapegoat, was dismissed by his master, and at the beginning of 1720 Philip V. agreed to make peace. Stanhope had thus been successful in the south of Europe, and the Peace of Utrecht in its main features remained intact. His high-handed proceedings towards Spain, however, brought with them unfortunate results, and the relations between the courts of St. James and Madrid remained strained during most of the century. Stanhope's eager and in some respects lamentable anxiety to check the resurrection of the power of Spain was due to the desire of George I to intervene in the affairs of Northern Europe. There Sweden was opposed by a league of powers which included Russia, Prussia, Saxony, Denmark, and Hanover. In 1716 the Hanoverian ministers had quarrelled with Peter the Great, accusing him of desiring to establish himself permanently at Mecklenburg. The arrest of Gülenborry, the Swedish envoy in London, in January 1717, and the discovery of a plot arranged by Gertz, the Swedish minister, for an invasion of Scotland by 12,000 Swedes in the cause of the Pretender only increased the breach with Peter, who was accused, probably falsely, of being implicated in the plot. Having failed to secure an offensive and defensive alliance with the Regent Orleans, whom he visited in 1717, the Czar entered into negotiations with Charles XII. And Alberoni for an attack on the Emperor and an invasion of Scotland. Before these schemes could be carried out, Charles XII. Was killed, December 1718, and Sweden made peace with all the members of the League except Russia. In the war between Sweden and Russia, the former was aided by the clever diplomacy of the English envoy, Lord Carteret, and by the appearance of the English fleet in the Baltic. French intervention at length led to negotiations, and in 1721 the Treaty of Nystad between Russia and Sweden restored peace in the north. At the close of his ministry, Stanhope could congratulate himself on the success of his peace policy. The author of the Quadruple Alliance, which established peace in the south of Europe, he had also taken a leading part in a successful attempt to prevent the development of the northern struggle into a general European war. The alliance between England and France, founded on the dynastic interests of the House of Hanover and Orleans, was beneficial to both countries, and established a political system which lasted till the fall of Walpole. Between 1715 and 1721 an active foreign policy was required, and Stanhope's efforts were on the whole crowned with success. In England itself, the suppression of the Jacobite rebellion, followed by the Centennial Act, had removed all immediate danger to the Whig government or to the stability of the throne of George I. It remained for Walpole, a minister far more capable than either Townshend or Stanhope, to take further measures for the material advancement of the country and for the firm establishment of the Hanoverian dynasty. End of Section 1.